Let me welcome you to Understanding Cultural Differences within Asian Immigrant Families, including Asian Immigrant Teenagers, provided by the PA Care Partnership in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. At any time during the presentation, please type your questions into the Q&A feature, which you will find by running your mouse along the bottom of the Zoom screen. Today's moderators are Kelsey Leonard, myself, Jamal Ford, Nancy Massey, and Mark Durgan from the PA Care Partnership. Information will be available at the end of today's presentation for those seeking continuing education credits for this webinar or a certificate of attendance. This information is also available in the email you received from us today and will be in the chat during the presentation. I'll now turn it over to Nancy to introduce our guest.
Welcome. We have an amazing panel today, and as I introduce each person, would you please wave? And since you're such tiny photos right now, our first and our panel chair is Esther Castillo. Dr. Castillo is a scholar, educator, and mental health and social justice advocate with experience in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. She has nearly 2 decades of working experience in education as a teacher, counselor, community advocate, and faculty in various educational settings, including early childhood education, youth programs, adult education, and higher education. She is a proud first-generation college student and a 1.5 generation immigrant. You might want to ask her about that if you don't know what it is. Her identity and life story have strengthened her dedication to improving mental wellness and equities for Asian immigrant communities. Dr. Castillo has an MA in Humanities and Social Thoughts from NYU and a Ph.D. in Sociology from Temple University. Currently, she is the program manager of the Chinese Immigrant Families Wellness Initiative in the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation. At CIFWI, she implements and organizes all programming and offers wellness workshops to Asian immigrant parents and their children. Next on our panel is Sarorng. Sarorng is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice in Nonprofit NGO Leadership. Sarorng has over 30 years of combined experience in public, private, and nonprofit. She works to address the challenges of refugee and immigrant communities through direct service, advocacy, leadership, and organizational development. Through her dedication to serving marginalized communities, she has received multiple awards, including the Special Achievement Award for dedicated service in support of human rights of the US and an honorary degree, Doctor of Humane Letters from Gwynedd Mercy University. Sarorng is the Director of Immigration and Refugee Affairs and Language Access Services for the City of Philadelphia, Department of Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disability Services. Sarorng works to develop strategies and policies to increase access to behavioral health and intellectual disability services for immigrant, refugee, and special populations. Sarorng is a former refugee from Cambodia with lived experience of pre- and post-migration trauma and the first in her family to earn a college degree. Next, we have Nari Keith. Dr. Keith is a marriage and family therapist and community organizer with knowledge of migration-related trauma, immigrant and refugee experiences and policies, and youth and family in crisis. She has 10 years of experience working with vulnerable communities. She believes in the importance of giving back to the community that has a hand in shaping the person you will become. The question she often asks of others is, how do you engage in social responsibility? And how do you put back into the universe what was given to you? Dr. Keith currently works as a director of Children's Mobile Crisis Team at PATH, a behavioral health organization in Northeast Philadelphia. In this role, she provides oversight of the daily operations of the Mobile Crisis Program. She is also the co-founder and executive director of Kith Integrated and Targeted Human Services, a nonprofit organization with a mission to help immigrants and refugees have opportunities for independence, growth, healing, and economic development. She has a master's in marriage and family therapy from Drexel University and a Ph.D. in community and social services from Capella University. Her educational achievements and professional career have been influenced by her experience as a refugee from Cambodia. She understands the need for linguistically and culturally appropriate services that go beyond behavioral health. Her systems thinking training has guided her current work with youth and families in crisis and with immigrants and refugees attempting to navigate the larger system. Next on our panel is Noel Ramirez. Dr. Ramirez is the son of two beautifully resilient Filipino immigrants and grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey. He is a clinical social worker dedicated to creating opportunities for folk and communities to find a home within themselves. Dr. Ramirez is the director and owner of Mango Tree Counseling and Consulting, a group practice and mental health resource center for Asian American Pacific Islanders folk in Pennsylvania. Outside of Mango Tree, Dr. Ramirez is involved in varying community health and empowerment initiatives, specifically in working as a behavioral health consultant at a local federally qualified health center, teaching graduate social work practice on intersectionality and healing-centered practices at Columbia University and Westchester University, and social empowerment programming with Philadelphia Asian and Queer. He received his doctorate at behavioral health from Arizona State University, a graduate degree in public health from Drexel University, and his MSW from the University of Pennsylvania. Next is Felicia Chen. Felicia is here as a representative from the young adult community and is a senior studying nursing at the University of Pennsylvania. She is also a proud graduate of the Chinese Immigrant Family Wellness Initiative Leadership Program and is a current junior board member. Felicia actively creates educational content on social media to emphasize mental health awareness among Asian American adult youths. Felicia recognizes that the unique challenges of her own family's wellness are felt among many other Chinese immigrant families. With a passion and the privilege to lead, Felicia aspires to be a healthcare practitioner who will positively influence the physical and mental wellness of Asian American youth. And now to the fireside chat among our panelists. I turn it over to Esther Castillo.
Thank you, Nancy. So thank you everyone for joining us. And I'm very excited about the conversation today. I hope you are too. And without further ado, I'm gonna just start with the question. So the first question is for Noel, Nary, and also Sarorng. And it is, what are some of the trends and in mental health and what are some of the trends and mental health themes that you've come across in your work with the AAPI population? With families and adults. Thank you.
Yeah, we're not sure who's going to go first, but I can start. I can lead the conversation a little bit.
Go ahead, Nary.
Okay. So I will speak a little bit kind of specifically related to Southeast Asians and immigrants and refugees and the patterns I've seen in the last 20 years or so when it comes to mental health treatment or mental health access. So a lot of the trends that we're seeing is that a lot of the immigrants who have migrated or refugees who have come here 40 plus years ago are still struggling with a lot of trauma symptoms. And a lot of it is because they're not accessing mental health treatment in a way that is accessible to others who are more English proficient or who has less barriers in accessing treatment. When they do access treatment, the symptoms aren't approached in a very holistic manner. So the symptoms, you can say, range from anxiety to depression to post-traumatic stress disorder related to trauma of displacement and migration, but instead of addressing it from different perspective, they're really looking at it from a Western perspective with medication management and talk therapy, where it has to be more inclusive, relating to faith, spirituality, family, and community. I could give an example of a person coming in saying that their trauma and their experiences is related to karma, bad karma. A therapist who doesn't understand that can shoot that down and say, well, let's try, other interventions, and let's not think about karma because you can't control that. If you don't address their belief at that moment, you're not going to retain that person's attention and participation in treatment. So in the last, I would say 10 to 20 years ago, that is a trend I've seen, is that these symptoms aren't being addressed in a way that is meeting the person where they are and what they believe in.
Thank you. And Sarorng and Noel, you have anything to add?
I do, actually. I just want to talk a little bit about the experience of youth and also adult in our community. For children, they face with peer pressure, wanted to be accepted in the society, and yet expected by the elder to do well in school, keep one own cultural heritage and language, and that can make young people feel torn and stressed. I remember my son, who did not want to make his dad and I feel disappointed, continue to stay in college, taking courses that he's not interested, against his passion to become a helicopter pilot, and that caused him a lot of stress. For older generation who had gone through war, genocide, political conflict, lost their loved one, being displaced from their home country and forced to adjust to a new culture, many experience stress, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Most Cambodian older adults had no chance to formal education and no marketable skill. They face discrimination, racism, have to do labor-intensive work, long hour in factory warehouse with no flexible schedule, unable to show up at parent school teacher conference or spend quality time, leave children feeling unloved, unsupported, and they feel unmotivated, and that make them become rebellious and lead to generational conflict and generational gap. When parents have to rely on their children to provide interpretation, translation, that create a power dynamic and cause parents to lose their self-esteem and self-worth. Without proper support and intervention, parents can lose control and children can become delinquent. So without knowledge of family and criminal justice system and lack of resources or proper representation in the court, youth end up in foster home far away from their parent and community. That is so difficult for their parent to reconnect. And some end up in jail and then face immigration, detention, and deportation that rip family apart. And that causes more traumatic experience for the whole family. And that is perpetuating. So I wanted to leave right there and turn it to Noel.
Yeah, everything everyone's saying, I'm totally vibing with. And I'll just say that across the board, mental health, like Asian American Pacific Islander folks are completely underserved, both in the realms of research and just anecdotally. I mean, many of us work in the communities we see where there's limitations. But I think some of the research that's even out there, this larger narrative, I question, right? So like when I was starting my business, there's this language of like, Asian Americans are the lowest help seeking folks with mental health, and like we're slammed. Like there's a lot of folks who are accessing mental health at this time. So I think even some of the population research that's produced out there, I have a lot of questions about because it doesn't line up to the here and now realities. One of the things that many of my clinicians and I we're calling it precarious citizenship. It's a theme that comes up with a lot of folks because folks are AAPI folks are part of a population whose citizenship, loyalty, and connection to their experiences here are often questioned. And so I think that brings up a lot of anxiety that folks are coming to the therapy room in. And as well, one thing that is coming up, I think a lot of us in the AAPI community have several moments where our identities are politicized. And right now, and when that happens, we kind of like question our inner worlds. We seek meaning. We want to know what's going on. And I think what's been going on in the past 2 years, there's been a lot of further politicization of our identities, but it's happening at the same time. And so a lot of people all together collectively are having these really important conversations and are really hungry to kind of verbalize what's going on and to seek towards pain. So I think that's what I think we're seeing here, at least in my experience.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And one thing that Noel talked about is this precarious citizenship, and I personally also experienced it. And I remember last year, soon after George Floyd, and around the same time last year, there were a lot of conversation about identities and race in the Asian community, and that has in turn generated a lot of conflict between the different generations, right? And both Sarorng and Nary talked about Southeastern Asian experiences, being refugees, experiencing wars, and post-traumatic disorder, stress disorder as a result. Can we talk a little bit about this intergenerational conflict, these trauma that are being transmitted from one generation to another, and what are the impacts of this intergenerational transmission of trauma and these conflicts in Asian family? And I'm going to pass it to Nary.
Yeah, so many of you may have heard the term intergenerational transmission of trauma, transgenerational, multi-generational transmission of trauma. And, you know, a lot of it, when you think of it, to help you understand what the impact looks like, is like, think of growing up in a family that has domestic violence, abuse, a parental incarceration, parent have mental health issues. So a lot of those trauma and their symptoms are being passed on to generation after generation if they're not resolved. So if someone is being abused, say a child comes to their parent and say, I've been sexually abused by so-and-so. That parent, who may have also been sexually abused, and their parent may have also been sexually abused, may not know how to respond to that. And it could lead to a lot of discord and dysfunction within the family. It could lead to the child not feeling accepted or understood or validated. So that's an example of, you know, a lot of what you hear about in terms of families and trauma. What you tend to not hear about, and what the research is lacking, is that trauma related to displacement, related to war, related to migration. And the parents who are experiencing firsthand trauma attached to being witnesses to execution and separation are coming to a new country, having to deal with a second set of trauma already and not resolving the initial trauma. So then what happens is that they're either minimizing their symptoms or denying it. And when that happens, the child is not fully connected to the parent. The parent can't really attach in a way that would be healthy for a child growing up. So what you see in a lot of the Southeast Asian, and I mentioned Southeast Asian because that's where my research is, and that's where my expertise lies, mostly with the Cambodian community. What you'll see a lot is a lack of educational attainment. There's a huge high school dropout rate among Cambodian youth. A lot of gang activity, and a lot of it is, the gang activity is due to wanting some kind of comfort, wanting some kind of connection with someone else who's not experiencing the level of trauma that they're used to at the home. So you see a lot of youth being rebellious, lack of connection. You live in the same household, but there's such a disconnect. There's a language barrier within the same family household. There's an emotional disconnect. There's no vulnerability within family members when they're trying to build a relationship outside of those trauma. So what happens is that, you know, they're left with feeling a sense of insecurity, a sense of loss. And, you know, the only way to move forward is to really to address how that person's direct trauma is impacting the generation, because if not, like if I was impacted by my parents' trauma and I'm not going to resolve that, I'm passing that on to my daughter. My daughter's going to pass that on to her children, and so forth and so forth. And it's a never-ending cycle.
Mhm.
Thank you, Nary. And I also have a 5-year-old daughter, and I hear you. One thing that I really try to do is end the cycle of intergenerational trauma. And speaking as a Chinese American, I hear some of the similar themes, although very different as well, because we didn't really go through the war. A lot of Chinese Americans came here as immigrants instead of refugees. So those circumstances are different, and we deal with different sets of trauma. But those that are related to immigration seem very similar, like the translation situation. The younger kids have to translate for their older parents, that a lot of them have linguistic barriers and navigating the system, and those kind of barriers are very similar. And I just want to ask Noel, do you see similar or differences in the Filipino community in terms of transmission of intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of themes that are related to the colonization histories that were happening there that we see. I see this a lot in like themes of scarcity. I see this a lot in themes of like urgency, anxiety. I see this sort of like hypervigilance that happens a lot when it comes to violence. And when we do like family therapy, we often will hear just some really different themes of pain and hurt. And so I think whenever there's displacement and disruption and migration and all these changes, especially amongst the family, yeah, this is something that I think is something that we see in different places, but certainly at different levels.
Mhm. Can I add just one thing real quick?
Sure.
When I was working at the Cambodian Association, we usually host youth support groups. And what we hear a lot from the youth is that they did not know how to really talk to their parent about their own struggle, because they saw their parent are really struggling with expressing the emotion. They would see their parent like after working long hours, and then if they get stressed out, they just lock themselves in the room. And that is really create this like a barrier in terms of communicating and addressing the emotional and wellness, and that it's really put a huge pressure on the youth to really know how to address their own. And at that school they don't have that support either in terms of addressing mental health, and that really compounding the traumatic experience. That's why it lead to youth suicidal or suicidal ideation. And there has been research the increase of suicide among Asian youth.
Thank you, Sarorng. And I want to ask Felicia, because you are the second generation Asian American. You particularly, you're Chinese American. I know that you live some of these experiences that we've just talked about. Can you talk about how these dynamics have shaped your relationship with your parents, with your family?
Yeah, honestly, feel like all the panelists have so far really like honed in on really key major themes that I've personally lived through with my parents. So I'll share a little bit more a personal sort of story anecdote that kind of highlights the themes. So like my parents' immigrant story is like unique, but also similar to many of the Chinese immigrants that they came to the States hoping for more work opportunities and a better future for their children. And the bright side of it is that they're able to raise 3 children with their own 2 hands in their Chinese family restaurant. But on the flip side, they've definitely faced a lot of exploitation and discrimination over the years leading up to I guess the so-called like reward right now. As like the first child in the family, I've definitely seen the entirety of their struggles. When I was in middle school, I remember really precisely to this day still that I woke up in the middle of the night and just hearing my mom calling me, and she was like her voice was shaking, and she was telling me that my dad had a gun held to his head and was threatened to give up his wallet and phone while he was just going out to make a delivery over at like in the middle of the night. And like as a child, I think that incident just still really like struck me up until this day. Even though I didn't live through it directly, it was indirectly affecting me. And that incident, along with so many other traumas that my parents have faced, it really caused them to really put their guards up high, to not trust others easily, and really just to talk less and work hard to make money. And to the extent these traumatic experiences have affected my parents directly, it transcended to hurt the relationship between like them and their children. And that's because I kind of realized, like, growing up, I was curious about like their lives and wanted to have like ask questions and really just like know my parents more. But every time I try to do that, they would either like choose to ignore me or just say to not worry about it. And being that younger self, when I heard that response, I just felt pushed away and just had to feel like I had to ascribe to their communication style of talking less and working hard whenever I interact with them. And like that lack of verbal communication and willingness to like kind of talk with each other has just always set like a barrier between my parents and I. And over time has this lack of like trust also accumulated between my parents and I and my siblings, of course. And like recent years, it has definitely attributed to like the family tension, as we all grow up to have our own set of, like my siblings and I grow up to have our own set of beliefs and values that might conflict with our parents, namely like just our views of success, our career choices, our relationships with people, and like mental wellness in that aspect too. Yeah, so that was just a brief story of how I think intergenerational trauma really affected myself and my family.
Thank you so much for your bravery and vulnerability to share your family story and your struggle communicating with your parents. And I'm sure a lot of us, if you grow up in Asian immigrant families, you might relate to a lot of this. I personally can relate to a lot of these, and I can see similar dynamics in a lot of the Chinese families that I work with professionally. Moving on, I want to talk about some of the barriers and access points in mental health care and treatment that is particular to AAPI community. And can we talk about some of the barriers, like what Noel said that earlier? We've got some of these statistics saying that Asian Americans are the least likely to seek mental health care. And I hear some doubts about that particular statistic. Maybe we can talk about what are the barriers and why is it hard for AAPI to seek help. And maybe we can start with Nary, and then Sarorng, and then Noel, in that order.
Yeah, so I agree with Noel when he said that Asian Americans, AAPI community, are seeking mental health. They want mental health treatment. They understand the importance of mental wellness and overall mental health. The issue with the city of Philadelphia is that accessing mental health is very difficult and challenging, especially for those who are limited English proficient and logistically. So, they can't travel to certain locations for treatment. And if they do get so lucky enough to get an appointment at a treatment center, they don't have the language capability to really support that therapeutic relationship. I get it, there's language line, there's other translations, interpretation tools, but it really takes away from the therapeutic relationship when there's a third party. That client, that person then starts to build that relationship with the interpreter and not the therapist. And so everything gets lost in translation, and that relationship doesn't go anywhere. So what you see happen is that people will engage in an intake, will start services, but will not continue. Mm-hmm. And then the cycle continues. They'll say, I don't understand why I'm not getting better. I saw a therapist, but they didn't develop that relationship with the therapist enough to stay with that therapist to understand and develop coping skills that are healthier than what they're using. So, the city, like in Philadelphia, they're doing a really good job. I think Sarorng can talk more about that in language access. But when it comes to mental health, there's not enough agencies or providers, treatment centers that have staff with the clinical skills to address the issues. And even if you don't have the language skills, you can have the cultural skills, the cultural knowledge to understand the person's needs, but I don't think that's happening in a way that is enough for the AAPI community. Like I said earlier, my first comment was that they're not really inclusive to incorporating faith-based or spiritual beliefs. And a lot of the AAPI community, Southeast Asian, Cambodian refugee communities are on Medicaid. So when you're on Medicaid, you're using city-funded insurance, and city-funded insurance means your treatment plan has to look a certain way, unless if it doesn't look that way, you can't get paid. So there's no kind of flexibility with how we treat immigrants and refugees in the city. We're so limited and boxed in to what the funders have to say, who are not in the field doing the work. So that's the barriers, and hopefully this conversation will open up. Someone on this 218 participants here hear this, and one of the funders to say we need to think of how we fund mental health treatment if we want Asian Americans, AAPI, immigrants and refugees to access treatment that they deserve and need.
Yeah, I echo what Nary already said. Everything that she said is so true, including the limited number of providers who are culturally and linguistically centers to serve APIA community. And stigma is a huge barrier because many Asian American or Asian refugee and immigrant still not understanding fully what is behavioral health, what is mental health. And that has been a huge barrier to treatment as well. In terms of barrier, I have my own personal challenges seeking treatment. I have done a lot of self-care and seeking alternative treatment, but I had my personal journey to recovery from pre and post-migration trauma. And whenever there's horrific news that my trauma would be triggered, around the time when news was really hot, when the children crossing the border were placed in detention, putting in cage, I was re-traumatized. And I couldn't function for days. And when I was seeking treatment, I went to a counselor. And when I was there, it took me time to open it up. And by the time I just start opening up, the time is up. Well, your time is over now. I need to see another person. While I was pouring my heart out, now I have to recollect myself and then to walk out more traumatized. So that was an experience that I never forget, and that it was more traumatic for me, and I never went back. So that was a big challenge. And that, for me, I grew up working, being really a professional, working in even the field and know my way around still is a challenge for me. Imagine those folks who really have limited English proficiency, cultural barrier, and other barrier like access to transportation, insurance, and all that would be a lot harder. So that is a little bit about my personal experience to treatment.
I've been a clinician in Philly, community mental health specifically for the past 13 years. So everything definitely Nary said, I'm like, and I'm just so I don't get too political, because I tend to do that sometimes. I think there's a question around even like, is community mental health sustainable? Like, are we creating systems where there's sustainability to not even to maintain workers, period, as a whole? So I think there's a lot of like, the AAPI community, we're an underserved community, but it's a system. I think there's a lot of systems issues that we need to start thinking about quality assurance in different ways, because there's a lot of like disruptive systems in general that maybe I don't know if I want folks to be involved in that particular system sometimes, and at least from what I've seen. So again, I'm just gonna say that. But also, I think one of the products of intergenerational trauma is shame. And some folks, when we experience generations and generations of shame, a lot of folks are really good at swallowing pain, not talking about it, to tolerate disruption and postpone repair. And postponing treatment becomes part of that postponing repair, not accessing care if it's not completely necessary. I work in federally qualified health centers, and whenever I'm working with AAPI folks, specifically where there's significant areas of trauma, it doesn't come up as like, hey, I'm getting some hypervigilance and I'm having, all these issues. There's very serious medical issues that get intensified by a lot of the internalized anxiety and behavioral issues that come up. In fact, I think of like my own father. He'll use this language with me when, I mean, of course, he has a therapist child, which is, if you were to see our conversations, are hilarious. But he'll end the conversation with, Noel, I'm a survivor. And when I hear that, I'm like, oh, here it is. That language doesn't really lend a lot of room to process like emotions or feelings. It's just about surviving. I think modesty is also another element of collectivist culture that comes up. And so to even acknowledge emotions, for some cultures, is a thing. Saving face, the idea of acknowledging the wrong and the pain, creates shame. And not just shame in general, but shame in the family. And again, a lot of the consults I do a lot of consults with folks who are interested in getting paired with AAPI therapists. Folks will say something like this: my therapist didn't get the race thing. And I'm like, what? And that really bothers me, because that makes me wonder, as clinicians and as educators, what are we really teaching folks in our graduate programs? Like, are we talking about this, or are we talking about this with a very specific framework? And I don't think AAPI identity, I don't think colonization, I don't think resettlement, I don't think those pieces, which really color a different component of race, is being talked about in graduate clinical training programs. And finally, the other thing, I'll just say this: financial, even in the private sector. I mean, folks sometimes leave community mental health and get their own private practice because they're just fed up with the system issues, because that's a trend here in Philadelphia, and that's the truth. And then are charging upwards of like $180 for like a 45-minute therapy session. And that's just not accessible for a lot of folks in Philadelphia. And so there's not a lot of folks who are paneled in insurance companies. I think insurance companies make it difficult for folks to get unpaneled. And I just want to acknowledge those systems issues, because a lot of folks don't take insurance, and it's a whole thing. We do, but it's something that I'm noticed. Again, the comments is, oh, well, they don't take this insurance. And there's a lot of, so I want to say there's a lot of systems issues too that are part of this, but specifically intertwined with some of the values and some of the like generational trauma stuff that we've been talking about.
Wow, thank you. That's a lot to process, just thinking about all the barriers that are out there. And I cannot agree more. I experienced that too, and in my own seeking of therapy. Same with Sarorng, and I can speak English perfectly fine. I don't need someone who can speak Chinese, but sometimes just finding the person to understand the way that Asian Americans are impacted by racism can be really difficult to find that therapist who could understand, and some of the challenges that are specific to AAPI. And Nary talked about the systemic problems that usually people who are most marginalized, who need help or who need services the most, are those who are being given more barriers, more hoops to jump through, and who are constantly being told how they should seek care, what kind of care they should seek. And I myself, trying to run a community program, community mental health program, the point about insurance that Noel brought up is, I say it all the time, oh, but they don't take insurance. But I deal with all these people who have Medicaid, who cannot afford to pay it out of pocket unless it's an absolute crisis, right? So we get a lot of people who are in crisis, and due to this intergenerational shame, that they delay treatment, that they think that they can just quote unquote swallow the pain, that they are used to feeling anxious all the time, feeling depressed. It's just becoming part of their daily life. And sometimes feel pride about that, like, oh, I'm able to swallow so much pain, sort of like what Noel's dad talked about. I'm a survivor. I can swallow as much pain as we can, right? Become normalized, and that's not really healthy for our community. So we talked about our struggles and challenges. There are lots. Okay, can we talk about some solutions? I know Noel pointed to education, right? Clinicians who are not receiving the education that they should be. Sarorng and Nary talked about systemic changes. I think all three of you talking about systemic changes and how to make mental health care more accessible and more relevant to people. Are there some best practices you want to tell people who are in our audience? I know there are a lot of care workers who are in the field. Any best practices that you can think of at an interpersonal level or interactional level or even systemic level? We can address both.
I think the answer is in this room, the spirit of the folks that are involved. There are like everyone in this panel is involved in, like, we have our work, but then we also have our communities that we're doing a lot of great work here. So the spirit of that, I think, is in the solution. I think Dr. Ginwright, who's a ethnic studies professor, talks a lot about healing-centered approaches, and it challenges the current trauma-informed framework, right? So trauma-informed framework, we've all known about this in the community, and the big question is, what happened to you, right? Versus what was wrong with you. But healing-centered approaches asks a different question, and the question is, what's right with you? And it's a move towards collective versus individual symptomology, which trauma-informed care is really all about. It's all about creating a community among the healers. We were talking about some of the systems issues and some of the fee-for-service models and community mental health and some of the challenges in that. And that's a little different than, say, what does it look like to have a community of healers, which some of the neighborhood associations here, some of the community organizations folks are involved with are examples of that. And finally, this is another thing that I often notice, again, in my training in mental health, it's always been symptom reduction, address behaviors that impact thoughts and feelings. And the question, I think, in healing-centered approaches is this question of, how do we help people dream out loud? That's not in the curriculum, right? That is not in symptoms management, right? It's what is your dreams? What are a couple of years ago, there was some folks from the Cambodian Neighborhood Association. It was in this LGBT center. Mazzoni Center, I think, was doing something, and a guy came over and was just breakdancing from the Cambodian Neighborhood Association. It was his way of showcasing talent and emotion, and it was like a queer AAPI community that came together, and it was like a beautiful moment of like, this is our community, this is how people move their bodies, this is how people express themselves. I don't get that training in like graduate training programs like that. There's no words and language for that. And I think one of the solutions is we have to find a new way to create language of healing that isn't so medical and that isn't so clinical. And that's just my thought.
If I may add, there's have been a lot of programmings like Esther program and now Nary and all that happening is really a great way to address behavioral health, mental health in Noel just mentioned about all the approaches to mental health. One of the things that I have seen proven to be effective also is that really building mutual partnership, mutually benefiting both the provider and the community. It's really key to building trust with community-based organization that's serving those specific community to really looking into the strength-based, using public health approach to enhance their capacity through funding to hire staff to provide that continuum of care. Because a lot of time, folk who gone through crisis get treatment, but then coming out into the community may not have the support they need to stay well. And then they may end up going back to the crisis center. That costs a lot more money and a lot more challenges serving these communities. So therefore, having a continuum of care set in place is so important. A simplest way that I had personal experience with is when DBH-IDS partnered with community-based and faith-based and did a series of listening sessions that turned into like support group for many ethnic groups. It was a way to really just giving the opportunity tap into their strength and could provide a safe space in a trust environment for people to talk about these challenges, share their strengths, and find solutions to overcome their own struggles. That is a very simple way that community can really address their stigma around mental health, right? So right now at the Department of Behavioral Health, where I'm working with, I am working with my internal and external stakeholder to develop Immigrant Refugee Wellness Academy, which is a skill-based and knowledge-based training to train multilingual, multicultural immigrant refugee and equip them with tools necessary to take action-oriented activity to address the behavioral health in their community. And also we have developed policy and procedure and training to address the language barrier and to increase diverse behavioral workforce. That is something that we see as such a huge need. And through this type of collaboration with Pennsylvania Care and all the partner within the city, we hope to increase that services for the marginalized, for the hard to reach population, and also encourage alternative practices such as acupuncture, meditation, approach such as community gardening, social recreational activity that can promote wellness and reduce social isolation, because as human, we do need that social connection, which is a key to wellness. So like any one of us, you know, if you don't have any friend, if you don't have family support, if you don't have anyone to talk to, we are more sad and depressed when there's something is happening to us. Having a social connection and that social support can help us alleviate any of these struggles that we are going through.
I agree with what Noel and Sarorng has said about, what can we do, right? So as behavioral health providers, like we have to assess how we're outreaching and engaging with AAPI communities. And I want to stress two important things. One is your assessments, your initial assessments. Are you asking the right questions, culturally sensitive questions that will provide you information you need to treat this person, right? Two, do you understand the multi-factors of illness that looks different than what you're used to in terms of your training? Like illness, behavioral health conditions can manifest differently. So we have to understand psychosomatic symptoms. So as providers, you have to understand when someone's coming to you from the AAPI community saying, I have this stomach ache that won't go away. Yes, you can send them to a medical facility, rule that out, but they come back over and over again saying, I have this stomach ache that won't go away. You have to address where that stomach ache is coming from. In my culture, my community, if you look at the DSM-5, there's a cultural piece to it, right? That talks about different ways people respond to symptoms. So it's a word in Khmer that says kjal-jak, right? So when you, Sarorng knows what I'm talking about. So people will talk about that, and it really means wind attacks. Like you get the wind kind of knocked out of you. You lose breath. And it's because it's your anxiety, but they don't know how to explain that. They don't know how to explain that it's the anxiety that's causing you to experience those physical symptoms. So I want providers who work with API communities to understand and do more research and be more willing to understand these symptoms and to incorporate that learning and ongoing training within your own agencies. Aside from reviewing all of your screening tools and your trauma tools and your assessments, you definitely want to engage. What Sarorng was saying is to partner with community organizations, right? And that is really to get cultural brokers and leaders on the side of understanding mental health does not mean you're crazy. It is not something to be ashamed of to seek mental health and accept mental health. So I think I want to leave the people with that statement.
Thank you so much for your answers. As me running a community-based program, and I completely agree that we need more time and space for families just to have fun, doing things like music, play, something that doesn't seem like a direct treatment plan, but it's so essential and so crucial and so needed for our community, right? And I remember we putting out a survey about these immigrant needs in our community, and our number one need is English classes. And in these English classes, people can talk to each other. Number one is English. Number two is what? Number two is they feel lonely. They don't have friends. Okay. So by creating ESL classes, they can learn English. They can gain some self-esteem, and they can feel less lonely. They can talk to their friends. They can make friends. This is really good for the mental health of our community. But unfortunately, when funders are putting out grants, right? We're putting out these grant application out there. It is very hard to make funders understand why these essential services are completely critical to the mental wellness of our immigrant communities. And of course, some funders are more open-minded, but not a lot of them are. And then unfortunately, it's just really, really hard to find funding to fund these community-based programs that might not look like mental health treatment directly, but it's so important. And just to kind of follow up on what Nary talked about assessment, right? Screening tools. So just more zoom in on the practice itself. And also the multi-factor illnesses and the psychosomatic symptoms. Can you give us some examples of what does a culturally relevant assessment or intake questions look like? What are some of the really bad ones that you have seen before? And also some psychosomatic symptoms that are very common in the Asian community. And maybe all of you can add on after Nary talk about her points.
Yeah, of course. I think with clinical assessment tools, right? There's always a demographic section in each one, right? So including citizenship and migration and foreign-born questions. I think a lot of organizations leave that out. They don't think it's important to know whether or not this person has been naturalized citizen or a US citizen or an undocumented immigrant. All of that is essential and will and help guide the treatment and help you understand what this person is experiencing. So that's just a demographic section. But when you ask about trauma, because I'm assuming majority of the behavioral health providers in their intake assessment has a trauma section. So the trauma section is, I think it's very limited. It's not open-ended. It's very yes, no, did you experience sexual abuse? Did you experience child abuse? Have you been a victim of any recent events such as a robbery or something like that? But I don't think they go into detail about some of the traumas that are more complex, like with migration and displacement. I know intake is typically 120 minutes or so, 2 hours, and you're trying to get as much as you can. But for that person to come back, you need to know those answers. You need to ask those questions. You need to ask them their kind of comfort and what do they think this therapy will look like? Like, I think you have to help them understand what it looks like and what they expect to get out of it. A lot of my experience as a clinician with Cambodian refugees is that because they look at you as the expert, they want you to have the answer. Well, I came to you, so you tell me what I need to do. And you have to be able to explain to them from the onset, this is what it looks like. However, I'm also ensuring that we're including your perspective. Like, this is the therapy process, but you're part of it, versus I'm the expert and I tell you what to do. I think a lot of people have this misconception that you go to a therapist, especially with the Cambodian immigrants and refugee population, they want answers from a professional, or else they'll stop going. Like, what's the point? They're telling me, they're not giving me the answers I'm looking for. So I think it's important as an assessment tool to gather all of the information that would help them feel comfortable in continuing treatment.
I don't think there's enough frameworks of loss that are incorporated in intake, and that's I think a huge element in. And again, I just also want to say AAPI experience is very different. Everyone is very diverse, but there's this book, actually I have it in my book. It's called Brown Skin, White Masks, and it talks about in Filipino culture this idea of walang kapwa, which is like the loss of togetherness, feeling like an outsider, is this like kind of like intense feeling, which when you read through it, I mean, and I hear more about it, even just culturally, it reads as depression, but depression in the context of loss. And I think much of the like PHQ-9, GAD-7, it's very specific to the symptomology. And whenever I'm doing some assessments in my initial intakes with folks in my practice, I often will lean towards the flavor of loss and to see if that resonates with folks. And oftentimes there is a sense of loss in different ways, loss of community. Someone feels less Asian or less this or less that, loss of relationship with family in different ways. When people migrate in classes, how do we connect with our families who, like may not, I mean, when I was in 5th grade, me and my parents, we diverted in our educational abilities. How do I kind of mourn that loss? How do we mourn the loss of language? David Eng wrote this book called, I think it's Racial Melancholia, and talks about how melancholia is bereavement without acceptance. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, but no acceptance because as Asian Americans, we're in a world where our citizenship is often questioned, right? So I think the flavor of loss is something that I see in mental health. And again, is this peer-reviewed in a journal? No. Well, maybe David Eng wants something, but it's something that I think is missing. And I think loss is pervasive in general in Philadelphia, period. But I do think that when I think of AAPI subjectivity, that's something that I feel and I know to be true for my experience, and something I know to be true with some of the folks that I'm working with.
Mhm. If I may add, loss, add to Noel was talking about, identity is such a critical wellness part of our own root, right? When we don't have that sense of identity, especially among young people growing up in this society, into culture, like at home and in the American culture, they feel a sense of loss in terms of their identity. And that is a crisis within our society. And that, like, for example, if we all lump every ethnic group into Asian, and then there's a model minority myth that all Asian are doing well, we're really not addressing the underlying issues and all the different ethnics minority within the Asian community that have really a huge disparity, right? Between East Asian, the Southeast Asian, who predominantly are refugee, who left the home with nothing, had to start life from scratch and experience war, genocide, and all that, have so much struggling trying to first is to have the identity within the Asian community and within the bigger society. There's no study about, there are very limited number or limited education in the school, in a university that really teach about Asian identity. And that is creating a lot of barrier for young people to address their own, a sense of purpose, a sense of identity. I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Thank you for all your contribution. And I want to end our conversation on a more positive note. I know there are a lot of challenges if we look forward in front of us. I want to talk about some small or big triumphs that you want to share with our audiences. We have about 5 minutes, so if you can keep it brief, that would be great.
I guess I can go first. I think one of the biggest triumphs for me with my parents was actually sitting down to actually have a difficult yet meaningful conversation about the Black Lives Matter during the lockdown. Like I remember Esther said about time being so crucial. It was a blessing in disguise. I think when we were locked down, we had no choice but to be with each other, sitting behind the TV screen, seeing like the world kind of chaotic and bring up a storm. But for my family, it was actually a rare opportunity to really be together for so long when otherwise you would have been in the restaurant working long hours. And I think from that conversation, I learned that sometimes it's not always just the parents' like fault for not having conversations. And that being the child, like we do have to take some responsibilities and step up even just to initiate conversations. So I think I did realize that just knowing that our experiences are different and that really shaped the views of how we see the world. And the Black Lives Matter and its purpose, like me being the first generation Asian American is different from their experiences as Chinese immigrants. So we'll never be able to come in agreement on many things, but I think just having that step forward in just talking about our views of things that are hard really starts creating that trusting relationship that was never there before. So I think it was really a big triumph for us during such a chaotic time. And just like learning that there's a balance of being patient and listening to our parents, like in their story, and having that humility, knowing that they might not have the education to understand a lot of the concepts that we know today, but at the same time have a balance of educating them to the best of our abilities. And it's really up to like the time and multiple efforts to keep on trying to keep on trying to have like more of these hard conversations to develop better relationship in the future. So I'll turn it to Nary. You want to start?
I think with my work in clinical settings and community-based settings, what I've seen and what I realize is that every cycle can be broken, like a vicious cycle can be broken, that you can start to change patterns and create different ways of interacting, even if for the longest you had no emotions or emotional connection with your family members. Like I come from a family who have never hardly said, I love you, or I'm proud of you growing up. I'm getting 40 years old now. And it's just now recently that, my parents are saying, I'm so proud of you. And they would say it in a way, and they would show it differently too. Here's food. What do you want me to make for you? Or can I get you something for your birthday? I'm like, I'm near 40. You don't need to give me anything for my birthday. But it's changing. But like Felicia says, we have a responsibility to create that change. We can't expect that to happen with someone who doesn't know how to do it. My parents would never know how to say, okay, I need this from you. I need vulnerability from you. I need a hug from you. It's not like that. It's, more of a what do you need me to do for you? It's more action. But I am living proof that I'm breaking that cycle, and starting to show that it is okay to talk about emotions. It's perfectly fine. It does not mean you're weak. I think that's the idea, is that if I tell you how I feel, or if I let you know I love you, you're going to take advantage of that. So I think we have to change that, and it is our responsibility. But I see that as a triumph for our community. And I say our community as the AAPI community, that we're moving towards, the ability to show more affection, to display our love for one another without feeling so shame for it and feeling so insecure about it. So I'm proud of that.
I'll quickly say that cracking the code moment, I think for me, is often, and being in spaces like this where like I'm reminded that like we're part of a beautiful, like resilient community that gets each other. Before COVID, I had my first, well, it's not my first, I have this Thanksgiving thing in my house, and my parents were like, can we hang out with you? And that felt like a really weird moment, but I invite all my friends, and shout out to Philadelphia Asian and Queer. A bunch of folks from PAC came through. So they were like queer API folks, my parents, and some other folks that were there. And they like took control of like cleaning and cooking, which I was very grateful for. But it was this communication, just what Nary said, it was a cracking the code moment where it was, they were saying, you know what, like we came here, we found a Filipino community in Jersey City, you're in Philly. We're so happy that you found like this queer Asian collective, even though they don't say queer Asian collective. And we want to like celebrate your community by giving them all this food with this gigantic walk that we have purchased for you to make sure that everyone knows you have food in your house. This is like the language, this is what they're saying, but not saying. And the one thing that really got me was there was a Vietnamese person and a Chinese person who was there, part of PAC, and they came to my parents who were in the kitchen. And they knew that they knew without saying it that my parents were really uncomfortable because people were speaking in like this college educated English. And for my family, what happens is they shrink when they're around that type of environment. And so Quinn and Byron were there kind of like hanging out with my parents, like letting them know that they were there. And to this day, it's like the cutest thing. My parents will be like, how's Quinn doing? How's Byron doing? But it was this moment of like it was an intersubjective moment. Like I understood that my parents were communicating this love and pride of like my community, but my community also saw them. And that moment of, we also as second generation, first generation folks, we crack the code in so many different ways towards our family, and giving and showing up towards our families and what they want, and our communities and what they want in our own special ways. And it was so subtle, but I just wanted to put that out there as like that there is a lot of wisdom, I think, in our communities, even though there is a lot of pain.
Oh, like Noel, I am grateful for this space with all of you as panelists and also participant and sponsor. My triumph is the time when I had the courage to stand in front of 200 community members in a Buddhist temple talking about my own mental struggle with mental health, share my deepest sorrow that was bottled up for decades as a refugee, as a divorcee, trying to do so much for the community. It was a relief, a healing process for me, and a road to my recovery. With me be able to open up, that make it okay for many people in my community to start talking about their own struggle, because they look at me as a leader and who have solution to everything. And I told them that, no, I don't, but you give me strength. So I'm sharing with you that I'm struggle like many of you, and I'm learning to heal from within. So from that day on, I am able to embrace fully and authentically and feel whole and not ashamed of my own struggle anymore. Actually, I'm embracing it, my wholeness, and be able to present and enter the room as who I am. So that is my biggest triumph. So thank you.
Thank you so much for these beautiful stories and these touching stories. I feel like I should share a triumph. I feel like today is a triumph. I don't think that our Asian community, our diverse Asian community gather together enough is it might not be known for outside, like people who are not in the AAPI community, but we are pretty isolated circles within our own. And I see this kind of conversation as little triumphs that can lead to bigger triumphs, that I hope that more of these kind of conversation where we who come from different generations. I myself, I migrated here when I was 19 years old, Sarorng and Nary, you guys were refugees, and then Noel and Felicia, you guys might come from a different generation. I think these kind of conversation is rare and precious, and I don't want it to be so rare anymore. I want it to be more common, and let's make it happen more. And I'm very, very grateful for your honesty, your bravery, your stories, sharing your experiences, your wisdom, your knowledge with all of us. Thank you. And I will pass it to Felicia, who will share some resources that we have put together for our audiences.
Yes, so I made it into much more visually pleasant presentation for now, for the sake of the webinar. So this is a resource guide that we have put together, hoping that you guys could have more to walk away with at the end of this webinar. So the first slide, I've highlighted some of the intergenerational trauma research among Asian American families, these three in particular that we highly recommend you guys check out. And next slide, this has three really great mental wellness resources for parents and children. So for those who would like to take a more closer look at the School District of Philadelphia toolkit that supports immigrant and refugee students and families, I think Sarorng especially wanted to highlight this one. I'm not sure if you want to talk more about this one.
Yeah, thanks, Felicia. Well, thank you to the school district, the former director of multicultural, Ludi Soderman, who's just retired, working with stakeholders to compile the list of all the different resources within the city to share among providers throughout the city, and it's a great list. So feel free to check through it and really connect with all the different organizations, like I mentioned earlier, community-based, faith-based organization providers in different disciplines. So it's a whole lot of resources that are available in the city.
Yes, and the Chinese Immigrant Families Wellness Initiative resource page is one that Esther holds dear because she's the founder of this, and she'll talk more about it in the next slide regarding local AAPI therapists and mental health services in the region. So I'll let Esther take it away.
All right, thank you. And we have put together a, we call Civili bilingual therapist list in Greater Philadelphia. And please check it out. It's a simple Excel spreadsheet, but it contains a lot of information such as language accessibility, whether the therapist is faith-based, the focus, whether it's LGBTQ focused or friendly, whether they take sliding scales, what kind of insurance that they take. So feel free to check out. And Noel has also, I think, put together some resources that he usually refer his folks to. And if you want to just talk briefly about it.
Yeah, these are just some really great private practice clinicians that when we're unable to see folks, we refer to. So some different AAPI folks out there in the community that are doing some cool work.
All right, last but not least, thank you so much everyone for attending the webinar. And this is a great little Google photo that I found that really resonates with us and those who are participating today. And I think Nancy will share at the end like a resource document of all the resources that we just highlighted.
Wonderful. Well, I think I've been pinned. Esther, is this a good time to jump in for our Q&A? Wonderful. So hello, everyone. I'm the Cultural and Linguistic Confidence Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership. Really happy to be here with you all. And just a virtual round of applause for the fantastic panel that we just listened to. One of the best fireside chats I've heard all year. And I think there's some echoes of those comments in the chat as well. So kudos to everyone for sharing your experiences, but as mentioned in the chat, also bringing a clinician perspective as well. So we've had a few questions come in. First off, and we've got a little bit of time before our time is up today. So if we start with one of our first questions, how do we reach the AAPI individuals who need support, adults and youth? Access is limited, often due to what seems like mistrust of outsiders. How can we develop more trust? I think you spoke a lot to that today, but just kind of seeing if there's any additional thoughts you might have.
I can speak a little bit about this. I think we have to first find out, who the cultural leaders are in these communities that you're trying to access. Mm-hmm. So, for the Cambodian community, there's a key, there are key leaders. There are key avenues to go through. If that person is very faith-based, very spiritual, and are going to the temples, we could go that route. If they engage in community organizations, maybe they're accessing services at the Cambodian Association of Greater Philadelphia, we go that route. So you really have to understand specifically, what race and ethnic background they are, and then research who the cultural brokers and leaders are in that community, because what you're trying to do is minimize stigma and shame with that person coming to you for help. And you're giving them options. You're not going to these people or other people without their permission. You're collaborating with that person, saying, hey, we can go this route versus just a traditional clinic talk therapy type of style.
Such a great answer. Does anyone else have additional thoughts there, or did Nary cover it?
I'll just say something really quickly. For the Chinese community, it's very similar. You need to find out who the cultural brokers are and develop genuine personal relationship with those in the community. And just if you are completely outside of the community, just find out what those community-based organizations are and develop real relationships.
Mm-hmm. And if I may add, really investing it in really what is the mutual benefit between your organization and the organization that you're trying to reach and build a relationship with, because oftentimes many of these organizations, grassroots, faith-based, are being taken advantage of with bombarded requests but not having these resources attached to it. How can you build that relationship and mutual partnership that really strength-based, that really build capacity, that really help you reach your goal, addressing those issues? Because partnerships can go a long way. That creates synergy, that create more trust, more collaboration, more resource. So yeah, build that trust, build that mutual respect and capacity building.
Such great points there. Really, really great. And you can't have trust without relationship building. You got to do the work. So the next question that we had come in the Q&A box was if you had any recommendations for foster care workers, particularly this individual as a white foster care worker, on how they can best address culture with AAPI foster children. They said, I'm clueless and I have not received any training on this.
I think the same thing what we just mentioned earlier is really to look who's are the leader in that community, and how can the leader can also connecting to the provider in that specific need for the family, for the foster children. Oftentimes, it's what breaks my heart is that there's so many white foster parents who really key and genuine, but may not have that capacity to really addressing the need from a cultural lens, right? So this is where partnerships so critical to build that trust and bring them to, like, I have seen foster parent bring their children to like a social event or events in the community that really build a connection and learn more. And so that has been really kind of opening up the dialogue and relationship. And, you know, from there you can gain more perspective and gain more support from the community.
I also want to plug in like another person. Liz Wade is somebody who does a lot of work with transracial adoptees. And so she has her own organization. She's AAPI person. And I think like just promoting, there's a lot of folks out there that are doing some good work and just doing the research to see who is like exactly who's out there and who is doing that work. And there's actually quite a lot of support groups in Philly that do a lot of work around transracial adoptees. So there's a network out there. It's just about finding those notes. But Liz Wade is definitely one of those folks that I highly recommend.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We had a webinar maybe a few months back now that also talked about sort of the impact of resources for transracial adoption. So I think that's a good point as well, that there's a whole breadth of literature and folks working in that space, and there's overlap here. Let's see, the next question we had come in was around, a few folks mentioned addressing intergenerational trauma. And so the question is around if you've also looked at the impact of intergenerational shame. I don't know if that's a concept that you've worked with or are familiar with, but that's what the attendee would like to know more about.
Noel talked about that. Like I forgot what question it was, but Noel addressed that a lot with what it looks like. You know, I think a lot of the intergenerational trauma leads to intergenerational shame. You know, so I don't know if Noel wants to just reiterate.
Sure. I was like, oh gosh. Look, so like the way I conceptualize it is like there's intergenerational trauma, and then there's like shame is a component of the apparatus of intergenerational trauma. And again, the way in which that shame is manifested is in many ways suppression, violence. Sometimes it's a form of numbing, you know what I mean? So I think that's how I would describe that. Though I did read, anyway, I'm not going to bring that up. I read something on like intergenerational shame around slavery in Africa and folks, and I was like, I won't bring that one up. But it was a really interesting article about shame, the enactments of colonization and the decisions people have to make in places where there is colonization. So there is a concept called something around intergenerational shame, but I don't think it applies to this quite so nicely.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's happened within a family. I mean, my parents really never share about their mental health, and what they do is they just keep getting busy, like working all the time. And I remember when my youngest brother gone through a lot of issue within his life, and that you know, dropping out from school. He was doing well, but then he started dropping out from school, hanging out with the wrong crowd. And my parents didn't want to tell me until like really, really bad, because they were ashamed that they were not able to really addressing the challenges that my brother gone through, you know, gone through like identity crisis. But then they had no other option. So they reached out to me as being the, you know, someone who grew up here, having the education here, working in the community. So that's when they reached out to me, asking me for help. So yeah, they did feel ashamed. And for me, I did not, when I gone through my own divorce and gone through my own depression, I did not tell my parents about my, you know, struggle because I ashamed. So we sharing that, like, you know, burden, and until we learn to communicate and learn to kind of address that, and our relationship becomes stronger, and we are able to help our family, you know, better connected and become healthier.
Yeah, shame is like the child of secrets and silence. And so whenever we hear those themes, I mean, there's so many, like gambling addiction, opiate addiction, you know, issues around children that are in a country that we find out we have a half sibling somewhere. Anytime there's a flavor of shame and silence, which secrets and silence, we see shame. And I think many of us probably see that in the communities as well.
Well, we have more questions that have came in that we have time for, but I thought maybe we'd end with a question and sort of closing thoughts question, which is, you mentioned a lot about sort of the dearth or the absence of enough research on the AAPI community. And so I'm wondering, and we had a question come in around, how could we be doing better in our evaluations and assessment demographics and collecting data? So if you were going to sort of, have a blank check or ask for more research in a particular space, what would you like to see more research in relation to the AAPI community on in regards to mental health?
What I want to see not happen is to lump all of the Asian AAPI groups together, because that is not accurate data. So to compare Cambodian immigrants and refugees to Chinese immigrants or US born, it's just not accurate. So to get accurate data on mental health needs, you have to separate that data. That is one thing I would hope that happens.
Disaggregation. So even the way I asked the question is the first step, refining
that is the first step. Yes.
Anyone else have thoughts on where you'd love to see research go? Let's say they get that right and they actually disaggregate the data. What would be some other areas that you'd love to see future research?
Talking about disaggregating the data, I also want to see more disaggregation between different generations, because people might think that, okay, talking about the Chinese immigrant community, people would think that, okay, they are all Chinese, they're all the same. No, there are so much differences between first generation Chinese immigrants and second generation. And I identify myself as 1.5 because I came here when I was young enough to quote unquote get assimilated, whatever that means. But then there are so many differences and so many conflicts between these generations. So I would want to see more research about different generations.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. Noel, did you have a thought? I don't want to cut you off.
I was just going to say, I'd like to see some more investment in creating culture centers, because, if it's not there, people won't come. And I'd like to see more research on resilience. We know that there's trauma, but I want to know what's right, and what's coming up and what tools people are using and how people are coming to themselves in that way. So those would just be some things that I'd like to do that. And more restaurants in general, food, culture, like just all of it. Like, I think it can't just be like the Center for Resiliency Research. Like, it has to be multiple cultural investment, I think, in a community that has been in many ways forgotten in different ways.
Yeah,
I agree with all the centers.
I agree with Noel completely. Focusing on strength-based, the resilient, the strength-based. I mean, I just want to shout out to the Southeast Asian market at FDL Park. That is tremendous to our community, and we are so proud. Like, we fought for so long to really make it become legit and visible, and now everyone come and enjoy and share the food, and not just that culture and also connection that promote wellness. So that, really a triumph for our community.
And can I add something real quick? I know we're running out of time, but when we talk about resiliency, a lot of times in our community, resiliency equals to our invisibility, because they think we don't need services. They think we don't need support, and it's not true. So remember that when you're serving the AAPI community.
Yeah, it's a balance. Felicia, you are one of our sort of youth leaders online. I think it might be good to end with your closing thoughts related to that question, or anything you might want to share as we round out.
Yeah, I think I've left this sort of just feeling like I learned so much more of all the work that's being done, and like all the things that still needs to be done in our community, and just being still young and still in college. I think I'm now going to go back to school and have like much more I had a direction like in mind, but knowing that there's so much work to be done in various aspects of health, that's not just physical, but much more mental. Mental health is so crucial in the AAPI community that it's just very inspiring, and I hope to really continue this conversation with all of you guys and make an impact in the world in the future. So.
Thank you. Well, as current and future leaders, it's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you today. I'm going to turn it back over to our team to close us out, but thank you as well to all of our attendees.
So I want to thank everyone for such an educational and informational session. I think you provided us with a ton of things to think about, and also gave us some hope for what the future may look like. So thank you all. Our next presentation is Fix the System, Not the Kids by Verdra Jackson. That will be next Thursday, July 29th, 2021, beginning at 1:30. We're 1:30 to 3 o'clock next week. So we look forward to having you join us, and have a good evening. Stay well.
Thank you all for finding the time to be here today and your sharing. It was a great gift.